Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully lunch was good. Anyone win any prizes? Or a few? No? Well, I might have something, but... Okay, well, I had the privilege of having the first session on Wednesday morning, and it looks like this is the last session, isn't it? Yep, got the last session on Friday. I'm surprised there's so many people here. You know, usually last session is like, do I really have to, go home early? So it's really good to have you here, and today we're going to be talking about Config Manager 2012. My name is Brennan Byrne. I'm a senior consultant with Microsoft Services here in New Zealand. Number of specialties. One of them is kind of system center / Windows / deployment, as well as all the kind of virtualization technologies we do. And this is all about lessons from the field. A new product comes out, and obviously Config Manager 2012 is a significant change from 2007. There's a whole lot of new concepts in there. And when that comes along, obviously, there's some things that you have to do different along design and the way you actually use the technologies. So this is lessons learned from a project that we did with a customer. They implemented the product when it was in RC form and upgraded as soon as it went to RTM, and then did a Windows 7 deployment with it. So it's just the lessons we learned through that. Now, what it isn't is, I won't be going into the app model in too much depth, because if you're in here and you know a lot about Config Manager or interested in Config Manager, you probably went to the app model one or migration. So I'm not going to be covering those two things. As far as an introduction and getting to know the audience, what do we have here? Who's actually deployed 2012? Okay, there's a few. Okay, so there's an old saying, there's many ways to skin a cat. I know there's a very horrible saying, but there's many ways to skin a cat. And some of the things that I'm going to go through, there's multiple ways you can actually implement these solutions. So these are just ones that we kind of thought that were kind of the best way to do it. Some of it's recommended by Corp, some was recommended or just felt right as far as the project was concerned. Who's got 2007 and looking at doing 2012? Okay. Who's on something else and is looking at doing 2012? Okay, there's a few of you. Okay, there's a few things that, 2007 that I really just disliked. And I can say that now because there's a new product out. If I came and talked to you, before it was released, I probably wouldn't have mentioned these things, but anyway. So there was some things that I didn't like, and that was the fact that there was only one set of client settings for the whole primary site. So if I wanted one client to have one set of settings and another one to have another, I couldn't do it unless I created a new primary site. The fact that if I had 500 packages and I wanted to add a new DP, I then had to go and through those 500 packages and add them to the new DP. That was just, customers always complained about that. Having to install a secondary site just to throttle information down to a remote site was another one of those things that I really didn't like. And also, you're doing a rollout, you're doing a migration, and you've got a DP on the remote site, and what do you want to do? You want to take your 80 gig of data or 100 gig of data and assign it to that DP, and it goes across the WAN link at a very slow pace and takes a very long time. There's no way of preloading it. Well, there were ways, but nothing supported. The main thing you need to do in this session is take off your Config Manager 2007 design hat. So if you've got experience in 2007, some of the concepts we go through, you really need to just throw away your old thinking and just realise that the product has changed significantly, and you might have to have a new look at the way you do things. So I'm just going to go through some design considerations for starters. So since there's people that are looking to migrate to it, let's go through some design considerations. Site hierarchy is one of the key things that you have to go through. So a central administration site there's a new concept of a central administration site, and really there's only probably three main reasons you might implement a central administration site. So if you want to scale for more than 100,000 clients, so is anyone in the house? No. See, this is US kind of scaling. New Zealand market, we never even hit, even close to any of their minimum recommendations. If you need some kind of autonomous administration between parts of the business, so say there's a couple of different businesses under an umbrella company and you need autonomous administration, possibly then you might create a central administration site so you can have a primary site underneath each of the businesses. Or if you're going to offload reporting from the primary site. They're the three main reasons. There might be other reasons. You often get a business that has a parent group and is buying and selling companies and stuff like that, and in that situation you might consider installing a central administration site. However, with the RTM of Config Manager 2012, it's a bit hard to connect an existing primary site to a central administration site. You actually have to install it in, so it's not a connect process, it's an install in. So that's the central administration site. Obviously with primary sites, that's where we're going to do most of our client management, but you've got the option of a secondary site. And in the past, you have, how many people in their Config Manager 2007 have secondary sites? Okay, so there's a lot. And usually the reason for that is you're wanting to throttle the data or your packages down to the remote site. And in some cases, some people might be trying to throttle the data from the clients up to the primary site. That was the main reason. It does add a whole lot of administrative overhead to the process, so that's why a lot of people had them. Now, with 2012, you can go through and you can throttle and schedule traffic directly between DPs. So if you've got a central head office site with a DP on there, and you've got a DP on a remote site, then you can set that throttling between the two, and you can basically cut out the requirement for a secondary site in that instance. You might use a secondary site if you want to throttle upwards, but really the amount of data that gets sent up from a remote site to like a primary site is relatively minimal, depending on probably the number of clients you've got on the site. And a secondary site can manage up to like 5,000 clients. So generally, you'll probably find that most of the secondary sites in here, you've probably got between maybe 5 and 100 clients. So the amount of traffic that is actually going upstream is relatively small. Now, if you happen to have a whole lot of traffic going up, yes, secondary site might be a requirement. But in most cases in the New Zealand market, small, medium, enterprise, no requirement for secondary sites. So really, and there's also, with 2012, you can have this tiered routing for deep network technologies, which, again, since the size of the New Zealand market and the size of the sites, generally you don't require that. So really, as far as hierarchies is concerned, try keep it as flat as possible. So if you're going in to do the design and decide on the hierarchies, basically go with a flat hierarchy first, and then justify to me why you need a central and secondary sites. If you can justify those, then fine. There's no problem putting them in. So that's the main thing. Keep it as flat as possible, and if you do think you need it, just justify the requirement. Because really, from an administration point of view, it's much easier to manage a very flat hierarchy than a very deep hierarchy. Like I said before, you actually have to install into a secondary site. So if you are a company that kind of buys other businesses and stuff like that, and they've got Config Manager, you're not going to be able to connect them up. You're going to have to install a new primary site into your central administration site. However, in saying that, if they've got 2012 and the like, installing a new primary site and exporting and importing all the objects is a significantly easy process now compared to what you might have had to do in the past. Just a couple of other pointers. Native and mixed mode, the whole concept, at the beginning of your design process with 2007, you kind of have to decide which one am I going to do. A lot of people went for mixed, and then maybe at some stage they went into native mode some other time for certain reasons. Doesn't really exist anymore because you can have groups of clients which are connecting via HTTPS and other groups of clients which are connecting via the more native mode. Schema hasn't changed, so if you're on 2007, schema hasn't changed, you don't have to worry about that. And all reporting is through reporting services, so there is no option to have the old reporting point. It all has to be through reporting services. So, some other design considerations. Source folders. What is a source folder? You probably find that you've all got different names for it. If Microsoft comes in and helps you out with stuff, we used to call it packages, dollar, and stuff like that, or sources, or source, or something like that. But basically it's a place where you import your source files from. So say you've got some drivers, you've got a location where you're importing the drivers from. If you've got some application source files, that's where you're going to import the application source files from. It's also where you save source files to. So say for instance you import some drivers and then you want to basically create a driver package. It usually asks you for a location where you want to save the driver package to. So you save it into the source. Now, our recommendation is usually have this consolidated source directory or packages folder or whatever you want to call it. Some of you might have a distributed model, so basically as soon as you get some software in, or some drivers, they're all in different locations, and we kind of recommend not to do that because then often when you're kind of trying to go and find these files, you've actually got to go into all the packages, look at all the settings, and then try find out, the actual location where they are. So to make it easy for yourself, it's quite important to kind of have that consolidated source folders directory. And a key thing that we've found really helps, is just to replicate the folder structure of the console. And I'll show you that in a sec. I'll just jump into a demo machine. But if you can replicate the actual console, that means when you jump into the directory structure, you know exactly where the files are. In relation to the console. So if you're going through the console and you look at applications and you've got one for Visio Viewer, it's under Application Management, Applications, Visio Viewer, then you know when you go into the directory structure, it's under exactly the same directory structure. You don't have to go into the application and find out where the source files are. So it can save a considerable amount of time and just it keeps everything nice and neat and tidy. Also, another consideration is to keep that source folder off the config manager box. So in the past, we kind of had our config manager box and we'd have our packages folder or our source folder. We'd have it sitting on the config manager box as well. It's just we wanted to keep everything in the same location as far as config manager was concerned. You can still do that, but there is an advantage to having it on a different server. So you've got the ability now to export all your objects. So when you export, there's two options. There's one to export like the object and the contents that goes with it. If it's an application, the MSI file and the like. Or just basically taking the configuration of the object. So for instance, if it's an application, just the configuration of the application and leave the MSI behind. Now if you export with both the content and the configuration, the export comes out and it's got this horrible path to it, and it's got some GUIDs, and it leaves it where we import it from. So if it's in C temp, that's where the location is going to be. If you just take the configuration, it leaves the source UNC path as it is. So //server/sources. Share. And what that's good for is the fact that if you go and install a new server, if you need to upgrade the hardware or something happens to the server and you need to rebuild it, and you go and import all these applications into your new environment, that means the source location on a separate server is still the same. And you don't get all these weird GUIDs all over the place. That makes sense? Yeah, kind of, some nods. Okay. Naming conventions. Now, Microsoft, we're sticklers for naming conventions. So really, at the beginning of your design process, include in the design naming conventions. Okay, and it's the naming of objects, it's the naming of the folder structure, it's the folder location, the source. Make sure you've got a consistent naming convention across all of them. So there's just some examples there for applications, drivers, driver packages, just so when you're in the console, there's this consistency across the whole environment. So, okay, this is just out of one of our design documents. So level 1 application management is really the application management node. Okay, level 2 is the applications node under that, and then we're working on the fact that the application is going to be called vendor. Okay, so Microsoft application name, Visio Viewer version 2003 service pack. Okay, no service pack. Custom revision is important if you've got people creating packages for you, because often they'll send you revision 00. And then you'll say, okay, I want a new version of that application packaged, and they'll send it to you and it'll be 01. So the custom revision is around that. And then have some examples in the naming convention. So if someone comes along and they have to take over your role or are going to be helping you in your role, they can look through that kind of naming convention document, understand how they're supposed to name all the objects, keep that consistency. So there's some examples there. And then just have naming conventions for all the different components that are there in Config Manager. So there's just some examples there. Now this deck obviously will be available after TechEd. So if you're taking notes, that's great. But if you want the deck will be available. Okay, so let's just jump out. This was 2. Okay, you want to see that? Okay. So if we look at applications, I'm just going to go into the software library, and this is just showing the source folders. If I go into application management, applications, and then I've got Visio Viewer there. Okay, and if I just look at the properties of that, and look under the deployment types, you can see there's an MSI version. Okay, so if I just jump out, and I think I put a shortcut on my desktop to source. Okay, you can see application management, you can see operating system, you can see software updates. If I can go into application management, applications, Visio Viewer, MSI. So you can see that it's replicating what's in the console. So if I'm looking at something in the console and I need to go look at the source files for it, I can just jump into that source folder and I'll know exactly where it is without having to spend any time trying to figure out and going into the properties. If I just go to another one, just to show the naming conventions, operating system, just jump back into the console. So you can see I've got operating systems, operating system images, Windows 7, and then I've got an image here. Okay, so that's the naming convention they've used for the image. If I jump into the source, I'm going to go into operating systems, operating system images, Windows 7, and there I've directly imported my image file. So it just keeps that consistency, it just makes it easy to navigate. Okay. Okay, so now we'll just go into some tips for the site system roles, just little lessons that we learned as we went through this project. These are kind of standard ones. I'm just going to rush through these. Obviously, use AD sites for boundaries if they're well managed, and if you're actually using lots of sites. Some people still have default first site name as their only site. That's obviously not going to work for your boundaries. So in that case, you might use IP subnets. And just be aware. This might seem obvious, but we have had customers that have created their boundaries and didn't realise that nothing would happen until they actually add those boundaries to boundary groups. Now this one you can take or leave. I like to just look in the console and know that, okay, that boundary group is for my site assignment. So you've got two options when you create a boundary group that you can configure inside the boundary group. So one is site assignment, which says that all machines on the site, they're going to connect to primary site 1 or P01 or whatever you've called it. Then the second is content location, and that's where you assign a distribution point for that boundary group. So what I've done is we've created one boundary group, we've called it SA, we've prefixed it with SA, and just said, Contoso primary site. And what we've done under there is we've put all the boundaries that are related to that primary site under there. That means when I look at the console and I want to look at site assignment, I just go to the ones that say SA in front of them. The other ones we've prefixed with CL, so all the boundary groups that are for content location have been prefixed with CL, and then we just assign the boundaries for those ones. And I'll jump out and show you, but that's roughly looks like it from a logical point of view. Also, we've used this concept of categorizing the collections. Okay, because you've got this ability now to create a collection, then have includes and excludes. So rather than writing queries for every collection you create, you can actually have like some default ones, which are the ones that come with 2012, all systems. Then you might create some generic ones. So they might be all servers and all desktops, all laptops, or all workstations to cover all of those, or all kiosks. So you've got some generic ones. And then you get down, you drill down into a specific function, and then you can start just including or excluding those different collections. And I'll show you an example in a second. We also create folders for the group collections, just to kind of group them logically. So if you've got a whole lot of collections that are related to endpoint protection, you create an endpoint protection folder. If you've got collections which are related to maintenance windows, then you create one for maintenance windows. And the reason we do this is some of these things you can enable on other standard collections. Like any collection I can set with a maintenance window. But the problem is, if I just go look in a list of all the collections, I can't really see easily which ones have got maintenance windows assigned. So what we do is we create a maintenance windows folder, then we create a collection which says maintenance windows and put the specific maintenance window, and then we use the include feature to take those other collections and put them into the maintenance one. And I'll show you in a second just to make it a bit more clear. Okay. Okay, so if I just look at the boundary groups, nope, didn't work, did it? Okay, here we go. So we just look at the boundary groups. You can see I've got one with SA in it, and if I looked at the properties of that, you can see I've assigned all the different boundaries I've got, and then I've just said, okay, this boundary group is just for site assignment. If you go and look at one of the other ones, under here, you can see that it's actually got the DP, it's using it for content location. So that's that. As far as the collections, let's just go into collections to show you. Okay, so if I look at maintenance windows, for instance, so I've got a couple of maintenance windows there. Okay, so take a step back. Device collections. Okay, so I've got all systems, which is a default one. So we talked about default. Then I've gone and create, all desktops, all kiosks. So they're all the generic ones that I've created. Then if I went into maintenance window, and say I've got a maintenance window between 8 PM and 5:30 daily, what I would do is I would take, say, my all workstations and I would add it. Actually, I'll go into endpoint protection. Okay, so I've got membership rules now. If the company that I worked with is in the house, see something here, then please forgive me. Yeah, okay, you can see something, but it doesn't say the company name, which is good. So I could go through in here and go add, include collections, and I could add my, say, kiosks to there. So you've got these functional got these folders, and then you've got these functional collections, we'd like to call them, and then you just include and exclude based on your requirements. Rather than going into these maintenance windows and writing another query, just use those includes, excludes as much as you can. So client settings, now you can have as many as you want, which is much needed. Some things that you might want to use them for is differing polling times. You might have some devices which are okay on 60 minutes. Some you might want to check more frequently just because of the nature of what they're used for. You can also assign the client settings to a collection which is based on a query. So, you know, something might happen to that machine. It might get some software or whatever the case is, but you've got a query that creates a collection, and then when that machine actually gets included in that collection, then it will get those settings for the duration while it's in that collection. So you can be quite flexible there as far as dynamically giving it different client settings based on requirements. We used an endpoint protection and maintenance windows. You could also use it for connecting via HTTPS. So if you're wanting that type of connectivity for some of the clients. Inventory. So you've got this option now, because you've got user device affinity, right? And you've got this option, if you've got this working, where you can actually right click on a user and it will show you all the machines they've logged on to in the last 90 days. Or you can log on to a machine and see all the users that have logged on in the last 90 days. Now, one thing to note is if your hardware inventory is set at like 7 days, okay, the information that comes up in this window will be very stale. Okay, so you won't actually have very real-time information. So if the service desk go on, they want to find out who's logged on the last day, they're not going to know until it does its weekly hardware scan. So what you need to decide is what is the most frequent period I can use for doing my hardware scans. 4 hours is okay, because hardware scans are relatively small and the amount of data that it generates is relatively small, but then again that's going to depend on the amount of clients you've got. So if you've got 5,000 clients, it's different than if you've got 1,000 clients. So just something you need to take into consideration around that. Also hardware inventory classes, if you want to say add BitLocker and get information about BitLocker, there's now a utility to do it, so you don't have to go and start modifying XML files and the like. You can just go into the little UI and tick boxes. Priorities. Now there's two places you'll see priorities. One place is in the client settings and one place is in endpoint protection. And really it just means, if you've got a number of client settings and a machine happens to fall under two of those different client settings, which one is going to get precedence over the other? So the general rule of thumb is the smaller the target group, lower the priority number, which is actually, the number's smaller but the priority is higher. Bit of pain that. So in that example there you've got all computers. Okay, so that's going to be the lower priority, so it ends up with 10,000. So the default client settings are 10,000. You might have, business units that you need specific settings for or something like that. And then you would create a client settings for them and you would give them, say, 100. Okay, and then you've got just a group of PCs which need specific client settings, then you might give them 1. Okay, so it means if that PC and that small group of PCs is also under the business unit one, it will get the one for the small group of PCs rather than the business unit. So it's just a way of determining what gets precedence. Distribution points. Obviously we talked about the ability to throttle and schedule. Now my screenshot here has the rate limits and schedule. My demo doesn't because I've only got one DP. So if you need to throttle, you just go into the properties of the distribution points and you'll be able to set the rate limits and the schedule through there. Also, Pixie and Multicast are actually part of DPs now. We've had one customer that kind of got in contact and wanted to know where the Pixie service point was. So there is no Pixie service point as such as with 2007. It is just part of the DP. Okay, so you install the distribution point, and then there's 2 tabs in there for Pixie and Multicast. Distribution point groups. So I told you one of the things I didn't like was the fact that, you know, you've got 500 packages, you're going to roll out a new site, so you add a DP to it, and then all of a sudden you've got to go through those 500 packages and assign that distribution point to it, which could take a considerable amount of time. Now you've got distribution point groups, and you add all the distribution points, you know, for those groups to that distribution point group, and as you add a new package to the group, it will go out to all the distribution points, and then if you add a new machine to that distribution point group, that will automatically get all those packages without you having to go through a manual task of doing it. So really, always use groups unless you've got a specific reason not to. Okay, so start with groups, and you can have multiple different types of groups. You could have one for the data center because there's only servers in there. You could have one for the, you know, the branches and stuff like that because they're only going to get a certain amount of information. But just make sure, use the groups first, and then only use a specific server if there's a reason to do that. Pre-staging content. Now there's a link up there which goes through the command line process. But you can pre-stage now. So when you go into the properties of a distribution point, you can tick pre-stage. And that will configure that DP for pre-staging. Then you can go into, say, applications and select all your applications, right-click and go create a pre-stage file. And that'll just ask you for a location. You create a file. You can take that on a USB drive, take it to the, you know, remote location where you're doing a rollout or whatever the case is, and then you can run the extract content utility against that distribution point. So no longer, you know, if you've got a DP on a remote site, you don't no longer have to kind of dribble it down over a long period of time. You can basically extract the contents there straight away. So what in this particular instance, we use this to do the initial rollout to the DPs, and then we took the pre-stage off and just left the throttling and stuff manage any future applications were added to the DPs. DPs, do you need them at all sites? One of those questions you've got to ask yourself. If the answer is no, then you've just got to take into consideration how you're going to get that information to those sites. So there are no more branch DPs, so you won't be using that. So branch cache is an alternative. But if you're using branch cache, the biggest thing is you won't be able to do OSD or operating system deployments using the branch cache. So you need an alternative method. So if you've got a site, say you have a rule, you know, anything under 50 users, we're not going to have a DP, they'll use branch cache. For those sites, you're going to need media-based installs to do the OSDs, or hopefully you wouldn't return it to base. There's 2 types of distribution points. So there's the preferred distribution point. So anything that is part of one of those boundary groups that we talked about earlier, they are a preferred DP for that boundary group. You can configure other DPs to be fallback distribution points. So if the content isn't at the primary location, it gives them the ability to fall back to another DP and get the information. So a good candidate for that might be say your head office DP. So if the information hasn't been sent down to the site, to the DP on the remote site yet, then it can get it from the central one. If you're using USMT, make sure you put the state migration point out on those DPs as well. So you're not transferring all the information, you know, the personalised information back to a central location. Try to keep it as local as much as possible. And if you're doing a rollout, our multicast, while it works, sometimes there's limitations if you're having to go across VLANs or across WANs and stuff like that. If you're trying to do a multicast over a WAN, yes, you can probably do it, but it'll give you a lot of pain and it will take a lot of configuration. If you're doing it across VLANs, yeah, you can do it, but there's probably some stuff that your network team is going to have to do. So if that's just a bit too much in your environment to get the network teams to allow multicast across all those VLANs, then and you're doing a rollout, consider doing like a roaming DP. So you create a DP, and as you're going along your rollouts, you just assign it to the boundary group that for that particular site that you're rolling out. And then when you do all your operating system deployments and application deployments, then it's going to get it from that local DP. And then the best thing to do with it is when you finished your rollout is to go and take it and put it in, say, like a build subnet. So if you've got a dedicated network where you kind of build up 20 PCs at a time, just put the roaming DP in there. If you don't and you turn it off, then when you go into like the content status of Config Manager, you'll probably have a whole lot of X's and stuff like that, a whole lot of red marks, and that'll be because you've got a distribution point which is turned off and is not communicating. So you either remove it or you put it in a network where it can continue to work. As far as branch cache is concerned, there isn't a lot of guidance online. There's some guidance, but it misses bits and pieces. So I've just put together some main points just to help you through this. So obviously the clients need to be configured for branch cache distributed mode. So that can all be done through group policy, and I haven't looked into how that changes with Windows 8 yet, because there's a lot of improvements with branch cache in 2012 working with Windows 8 clients. But for the time being, if you're doing Windows 7 in 2008, branch cache distributed mode. And when do I look at this? How to set it up. How to set up a boundary group to use branch cache. Okay, you've got your boundary group, you assign the boundary to the boundary group, and I'll show you this in a second. Then you take one of your core distribution points. In this case, I've said the primary site server distribution points, or your head office distribution point, and add it to that boundary group. Okay, so it's a distribution point which is across a WAN from that particular boundary group, and you configure it for fast. So no matter what your deployments say, it will always try and download that package across the WAN, and then when a client goes and tries to get a list of the DPs that are available to it, even though there's no DPs on that local site, it will get the distribution points back at your head office or your data center, or wherever whatever the case is, and then it will try and drag it down. Okay, it might take a while to drag it down if it's a small link, but obviously as soon as it's on site and cached on one of the PCs, then the following PCs are going to be able to do it all locally. So that bit there is something there's no guidance on that, and so I had to kind of go back to product teams and say, is this how you would do it? And they confirmed it. So this is just a configuration here. So you can see I've got the two boundary groups. One is for head office, one's for remote office. You can see they've got different boundaries, but I've got the same DP assigned for both, and I've got them both set for fast. And there's a couple of links there that kind of take you to articles, blog articles and TechEd articles which talk about how to do the rest of the branch cache configuration. Testing it. So you can test it, and sometimes it's hard to find guidance on that as well. So in Performance Monitor, there's those three counters, and the main one you're looking for is the retrieval bytes from cache. So set up a couple of machines on a subnet which doesn't have a DP assigned. Get the first machine to download the package, and then sometimes you just have to do it maybe twice. It doesn't happen after the first time, just because of some of the communication that's kind of going back to the branch cache server or your config manager server. And then in subsequent machines, you'll start to see that counter starting to increase. So that's the best way to test it. And like I said, be patient. It doesn't happen on the first time that you download it. It might be the second or third time. Yes?
Is there any guidance on using branch cache on the remote side, or what situation is the right substitution point?
Okay, is there any guidance on using branch cache and using a
The downside of branch cache is that if that PC
Yep.
is shut down by the user and another machine wants that software, then it might not provision. allowed now in CM2.
Yep.
So is there any guidance on which one would be a more sustainable?
Yes, with branch cache, you're right. If only half the PCs on and half the PCs, or one of the PCs that are actually turned off, had the cache, then it might start downloading it again. But it does get cached across multiple machines. So as soon as another one's downloaded, it might put it in its cache. So there's that. But you're saying using a PC as a distribution point? Yeah, well, that's kind of an alternative to branch cache. So you do have some customers who put a PC in there and turn that into distribution point.
The only drawback of using a workstation on DP is that you cannot have PC on it.
Yeah. So again, yeah, you don't have the OSD. Yep, very right.
Have your software distribution.
Yep, you can have software distribution, but you're quite right. You don't have Pixie, so you can't do OSD. Okay, I'll just quickly show you priorities. So priorities are going to be under, what am I going to do? If I look at the anti-malware policies, so you can see I've got a number of policies there. I've got my default client anti-malware policies, and then I've got one for servers, one for workstations, and one for kiosks. Now, workstations and servers should be, totally separate because of the queries that would be using to do that. So I'm not going to get one that's in both. But a kiosk could also come under the workstation query that I might have used. So in this instance, all the machines are going to get either the default one, then if it's a server, obviously it's going to get the server one. If it's a workstation, it's going to get the workstation. But then since kiosks are a member of the workstations ones, that kiosk one is the highest one, so it will get the kiosk settings. Branch cache. What was I going to show on branch cache? Oh, I think that was just showing the boundary groups. So you can see I've got the remote site here. And then I've just set my head office distribution point and set it to fast. Now if that was set to slow, it comes down to how you've configured your deployments. Okay, so you had advertisements in 2007, you've got deployments now in 2012. If you set your deployments up for, I think by default, they won't actually transfer anything across a slow network link. So you'd have to go and tick all your deployments and make them, or allow them to transfer across slow links. So that's why you configure it for fast. So it'll automatically just download it. First one will get downloaded, then it'll use it from local. Okay. App delivery. So I'm not going to go into much detail around app delivery because that session was available and it is a new beast in itself. It is very powerful, but there's a lot of things you've got to kind of get your mind around to be able to target machines correctly. Anyone go to that session? Yep, a few. Do you find it helpful? Yep, it is considerably different from the old version, but it is very powerful. If you take the scenario where for instance, I've got an application, okay, and I want to deploy that application to my user's primary device. Okay, so I can deliver that to the primary device, no problems. And that's an MSI version, native version. And then I've got a scenario where I log on to someone else's machine because my machine is something wrong with it or whatever the case may be, not that it happens with Windows. And then I put an AppV icon, in that instance. So my non-primary devices get an AppV icon. So when I log on to that device, if I happen to need to use that application, I've got an icon there, I can double click on it and it will stream the application down to me. Then I might go to a remote site and use a device. And because this application is quite a lot of heavy traffic between the client and the back end, maybe I don't want all that traffic to go across the WAN, so I can create rules which say when I'm at the remote site, then I get an RDP version of it. or a Citrix version, or whatever the case may be. So you can have these kind of administrative tenets, these administrative rules, to basically deliver the best app for the best scenario. And hopefully that should have come across in that session. So we really advise use applications, in the first instance. So if you're going to take an application and put it into your new environment, put it into applications, because then you get all the detection methods and requirements and dependencies, supersedence that you can put in the application catalog. If you've been to the migration one, you'll find that it will go into the packages one, then you've got to run a converter to put it into applications. I strongly suggest you do that, just so you get the ability to use all that functionality. And then there's still going to be places you're going to use the legacy packages. So the main place I use that is mainly for OSD type stuff. If I've got a bunch of scripts which are going to do some configuration or some driver installs, might be still an option to use packages there. User-centric deployments. Be prepared to create more deployments than you used to create advertisements. Because if I just told you about that model where we could deliver different types of applications in different scenarios, then you're going to need deployments for all those, and basically set the requirements based on those deployments. So be prepared to create more. You need to create install and uninstall deployments. So if you remove an object from a collection, it doesn't uninstall the software. It would be nice if you actually had that ability, and it's something that I see regularly in internal distribution lists, saying, hey, it would be nice to at least do it if you wanted to do it. But for the time being, you can't. So if you want to uninstall something, you need an uninstall collection, and then obviously there's some things you need to think about there. If you're using AD groups, and using AD groups is quite a satisfactory option to use to deploy apps to users now. So is anyone using 2007 and deploying to user groups? Okay, so there's a few. And when the user logs on to another machine, have you got wrappers around your packages and stuff? Yeah, because usually the worst thing you can do is deploy to a bunch of users in a group, and then you go to another machine and all of a sudden all the other applications start downloading. But using AD group membership now is perfect. You don't really have to worry about that. Again, you have to create a group for install and a group for uninstall. Now, if they're members of both, what happens? Okay, the install is always going to win. So as far as if the service desk are applying or adding users to groups, they need to be aware if they need to do an uninstall, they're going to have to remove them from the install as well. Otherwise, it's always going to win. And then by default, this is what you could end up with by default just for one application. So user install, so if we look at the user targeted ones, you've got a couple of install and then you've got uninstall. So there's the required, and that will just basically go and install the application immediately. Then if you also want it available through the application catalog, then you've got to create another deployment which is install available. And then if you want the uninstall, you've got to create one for the uninstall. And then same for devices, because in some cases you might still want to deploy to devices. While it's quite powerful to be able to deploy to users, deploying to devices might be what you have to do in some scenarios. For kiosks, okay, so you want to, there's no user that's logging onto the kiosk, it's logged on as a generic user, so you might want to use device-centric deployment to those. Again, the required will automatically install it, the available will put it in the software center. So you've got the software center and the application catalog. Application catalog is all about users, software center is all about devices. Okay, configuring user device affinity. So if you're doing your rollouts, and it looked like there was a few people doing it, and you're wanting to use user device affinity or the concept of primary devices and user-centric deployment, then you need to make sure that your devices have a primary user assigned to them. So the default thing you might do is you might turn on the thresholds. Now the thresholds by default are about 2,440 minutes over a 30-day period. So if you're doing your rollouts and they get their new computer, they wouldn't have used that computer for 2,440 minutes in a 30-day period. So you'd have to wait that amount of time before the user would actually get their user-targeted applications. So if you're doing your rollout, you're going to have some other way of initially setting them. So some type of administrative defined process. So you can either, one option, and the deployment team that I was working with, they actually changed, part of the process they were actually changing the user's password, because they were going from XP to Windows 7, so they were logging on as the user, doing a couple of things. So they actually went in and configured it so the user could tick the box. And then once it got to a period of time after that machine had been deployed, then it would change it back so the user couldn't do it. So that's one option. You can also define it through the console, so you can go to any machine and right-click on it, any device, and right-click on it and go edit primary users, and then you can just start typing in a username, hit enter, and you've added the primary device. Third thing you can do, you can actually, and I haven't done this, so I can't give you any more detail about this, but apparently you can do it through the task sequence. You can reduce the threshold, but the problem is all of a sudden you might have all these, they might log on to 3 or 4 machines, and the other 3 or 4, they've logged on to for an hour or 2 hours, just temporarily, and all of a sudden they come up as primary devices. Then you're kind of negating the primary device because you've got all these other devices as primary devices. So yes, you can, but it depends how much you want to take it down to. And generally, if you're doing a rollout, you want them to be able to get their machines relatively quickly after that. So yes, you can, but you'll probably end up with more primary devices than you actually want. And users can actually have multiple primary devices. There's no problem with that, but for licensing purposes, you might be wanting to keep it to 1 as much as possible. Okay, and this is a little problem that we had. Obviously, user device affinity and the thresholds work on the log on and log off audit events and event log. So when you log on, it creates an event. When you log off, it creates an event. 2 things about that is, if you haven't set up these event logs, you're not going to get the user device affinity thresholds reached. If you've got machines which actually stay on, logged on forever and a day, that can be a problem. I'm actually looking into that myself at the moment because I've got questions about that. But you've got to be careful around the GPO settings that you use, because there's new ones for Windows 7, and you can use either the legacy ones or the new ones. So originally we'd go in and we'd go to local policies and go to audit policies, and we'd tick those 2 boxes. Turn those 2 to enabled or success. Okay. If, however, you tick this little box under security options, force audit policy subcategory settings, and then it says for Windows 7 enabled, then it doesn't use the legacy ones, so you can't actually use that one. Okay. And someone had done the group policies, and I didn't know they'd tick that box, and I'd set those settings and wondered why I was getting nothing back. So you actually have to go down to the advanced audit policy configuration, audit policies, log on, log off, and then turn on the audit log off and log on. So that's, it took a while to find that. It took many emails to product team because there was no guidance around it, and they had no idea. And it wasn't until we kind of went through all the group policies that were assigning to the site that we saw this one that said, oh, use the subcategory settings. So please don't make the same mistake we did. So, now, software updates. This is another one of those things you can do software updates in so many different ways. There's relatively efficient ways, there's some ways which are not as efficient, but this is just one way that we often use just to simplify the process and kind of have the least amount of clicks in your process. So, there's the new concept of automatic deployment rules. So you can kind of set up a query, and the automatic deployment rule will run on, patch Tuesday or Wednesday for us. And it will collect all the appropriate patches and download them. So you don't have to go through that process, manually every time and creating a new software update list. Then we've got a bunch of collections that we've created. So the baseline one is really the baseline between when I built my image and when I actually implemented this, the software updates, because there's going to be a bit of a delta there. So you create this baseline, which is the difference between the 2. Then we've got test, pilot, production. Now, some of you might need pilots. You might just go for test production. Okay, but the concept is the automatic deployment rule. Actually, we'll step through it. Okay, so this is my timeline, right? That's Patch Tuesday, and I've got an automatic deployment rule which runs just after Patch Tuesday. So I think we set it up for like 4 hours after the general time when the patches are made available. So the automatic deployment rule runs, and it's got a deadline. Now that deadline is quite a short deadline. It's probably 2 or 3 days. Okay, and what that's allowing you to do, so you can see I'm going to do my deploy to test, and that's when the initial deadline starts. In between those two times, it allows me or the group of administrators that are looking after software updates to actually go and review all the patches that have come down on Patch Tuesday, because you might not want them all. Okay, so while the automatic deployment rule has just taken all Windows 7 patches, and whatever your query might have been, you might have missed out some of them, but you can at least between the initial time of it coming down and the deadline determine which ones you're going to remove from the software update group. So they come down, you do your checks, you determine whether they're needed or not. If they're not needed, you remove it, and then on the deadline, which is say 2 days later, then all your test machines get it. Okay. Next process is, once you're happy that testing has worked, and generally the test group is like a nice kind of cross-section of your environment. So if you've got different types of users, you make sure that those patches go to those different types of users. And whether those users know that they're kind of in the test group and they're guinea pigs or not is up to you, whether you tell them that or not. If they're that way inclined and they're very helpful in telling you things are broken, then you might tell them. If they're not, then maybe don't, because they'll just think every time there's a problem that's because of a patch. So the automatic deployment rule will automatically assign the patches to this deploy to test, or in this case the Windows 7 monthly updates test. Then what you do, once you're happy, you go into the software update group, you go into the properties, and you just change the collection that it's pointing to. So if it's pointing to software updates Windows monthly updates test, you just change it to pilot. And then all of a sudden, all the machines that are in the pilot group will start getting the patches. And then once you're happy that the pilot's fine, then you just change that same software update group to production, and then all your machines will start getting it. So the only thing you've really had to do is, the automatic deployment rule is a one-time create. The main thing you have to do is just determine whether all those patches are actually going to be required or not, and remove them if possible. Then it's just 2 changes of collections. So there's the deploy pilot and the deploy prod. Unfortunately, I didn't have internet access where I was, and wasn't able to kind of set up a demo. No, because what will happen is that software update group will be pointing at all the patches for that particular period, and will go to production. Okay. Then next Patch Tuesday, a new rule will be created with all the new patches for that time. And then if any machine comes in the environment in the meantime, it will get last Patch Tuesday's patches, and then it will get the next Patch Tuesday's patches. So you just end up with a lot of software update groups, and you could go and consolidate those at some stage, but whether you'd want to or not is...
So each Patch Tuesday will be a separate package?
Not a separate package, because you can actually have quite a few patches in a package now, but you'd have different software update groups. So the automatic deployment rule generally will create a new software update group, okay, but you can have it using the same package. And we usually just, there was a limit of 500 patches in a package. Okay, I think that's gone up higher to over 1,000. Yeah, so we usually just cut it by Windows 7, Windows Server 2012. If you think that's not granular enough, you could, cut it down Windows 7 July, Windows 7, and create it that way. But just more administrative overhead. So. Yep. Yeah. No. So endpoint protection, use the same package. and use one rule which basically doesn't go and create new software update groups. It just keeps updating the same one. Okay. And this it doesn't get as much airtime as it really needs. You can do offline servicing of your OS images now with Config Manager. So all you need to do is right-click on one of your images and go schedule updates, and it will give you that GUI on that side, and you can go through and select all the patches that are able to be injected into the image. And then once you click next, it will go off and it will mount the image, use DISM in the background to inject them all into the image, unmount it, and then you've got your updated image. I would just make sure that you've got your original image before you went and injected all the patches into it, kind of backed up somewhere else, just in case there is some issues. But that can save you a lot of time. That means the delta when you actually install the image and the latest patches is going to be significantly less when you do your kind of first Windows update. Endpoint protection, and we're running out of time. There's a whole lot of options now. You can go to different locations. You go to Config Manager, Microsoft Update, and stuff like that. Turn all those off and just have Config Manager at the beginning, so you know Config Manager is actually working. Otherwise, you might think it's working, but it's actually going to Microsoft Update. Always use the CPU usage, limiting CPU usage, and there are a whole lot of predefined policies that we have. So if you've got a domain controller or an SQL box and you want to know what the best anti-malware settings for those boxes are, if you just right-click on anti-malware policies and go import, then you'll see a whole list of those, and they're very good for your desktops and the like. Also, if software updates usually, or endpoint protection, you usually want them to be relatively frequent. So probably as frequent as you can get is about 4 hours, okay, because our malware protection center doesn't do it any more than once every 4 hours as far as releasing the definitions. So if you want to do it every 4 hours, you've got to make sure your software update synchronization is happening every 4 hours. So it is a delta, okay, so not much is going to happen in that 4 hours, so it's kind of okay to put it down at 4 hours, but you've got to make sure that, if you want endpoint protection to happen every 4 hours, that the software update is happening as well. And you can just see in the screenshot there that it actually says down below, this is what your current software update synchronization is, so it's kind of letting you know, hey, you've got to make sure that the times are the same. This is one that newbies often don't get. You have to enable Forefront Endpoint Protection 2010, even though you're doing, System Center Endpoint Protection 2012. The guidance on that, TechEd will tell you to do Forefront Endpoint Protection. A lot of people just go into the classifications for the configuration and go definition updates and think that's all they're going to need to do. But you actually have to go under the products as well and select Forefront Endpoint Protection 2010. I've seen that quite a few times. And this is kind of right at the end, so we're out of time. But security, if you load the Config Manager tools for 2012, there's an RBA viewer, a role-based administration viewer, so you can actually kind of go through and configure all the different settings for all the different objects and then see what the console would look like without actually having to go through and do it yourself. When you're doing your testing, just use a run as icon, okay? So you've got your full administrative console, and then you've got another icon which is going to go and show you what the user one is. Out of time. Just one last thing, reporting services. Okay, it was designed for Report Builder 2.0. If you're using SQL Server 2008 R2, it ships with Report Builder 3.0. Okay, and it comes up with this error message every time you try to run a report and you think it's basically not working. So there is a registry setting that you've got to change, and that will fix that. However, in some instances, well, in all instances, you should open that Config Manager console with a right-click, Run as Administrator. If you don't do that, you might still actually get that error message in certain places. So there was a whole lot of related content, which is all past. If you need to contact me, I'll try and go back. My email address is there, but thank you very much. Hopefully that helps you in your future endeavours installing Config Manager 2012. If you've got any questions, feel free to come up and ask me.